Hello everyone, I'm d.i.givens from the Institute for Food, Nutrition and Health in the University of Reading in the UK. And it's my pleasure to be with you today to talk about the association between fermented dairy foods and the risk of non-communicable diseases. And so I'll say a bit about the dairy matrix, which is part of that. Can I just start by thanking the organisers for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk to you today, which I hope fits quite well with your fermentation theme that you have. So I thought we'd start by just having a look at what are the disease issues that we really should be looking at, non-communicable diseases. Well, as you can probably see by the big red arrow, despite the fact that the mortality from cardiovascular diseases has declined fairly substantially actually in the last 20 odd years, it still remains the biggest single cause of death across the whole of Europe. That's, you can see there it's even higher than cancer, and that's to some extent contrary to what many people think. And so cardiovascular diseases should be still on our target for reducing the risk. The other area which we need to pay more attention on, I think, is the trend is related to the trend in the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. And you can see, if you look at the UK figures, Czech, Germany, prevalence in the last, well, since about 2000-ish, the prevalence has increased quite rapidly. And of course, what this hides, of course, is the fact that it not only has the prevalence increased, but the cost of dealing with it by the health services has increased massively. You can see that France seems to be much better off than the other countries I've just chosen. I've just chosen 4 out of the whole list of countries in Europe. And of course, you have to remember that the risk of type 2 diabetes is very strongly related to obesity. As obesity increases, the risk of type 2 diabetes increases. And that may explain why France at the minute is still relatively low, as indeed is Italy. So I thought we'd have a look at the 2 main dairy products that are involved in a fermentation process to produce them. So I thought we'd look at cheese and yogurt. And you can see, of course, that the milk originally comes from the animal, dairy cow, comes to the milk processing plant where it goes under a fermentation process in the processing plant. And the fermentation process essentially converts the lactose in milk, sugar in milk, to lactic acid using lactic acid bacteria, more or less. I think there are some processes that use some of the bacteria, but lactic acid bacteria is the predominant one, as you'd expect. And we end up with a whole range of different types of cheese and a whole range of different types of yogurt. And I'll say a bit more about that range later on. But the question then is, well, what evidence is there that cheese and yogurt are associated with reduced risk of some of these chronic diseases? A lot of the evidence we have comes from what I call prospective studies, which are studies that look at populations of people over a long period of time. They measure over all of this time, they measure at intervals the diet, everything that's in the diet, including in this exercise, in this example, particularly the amount of yogurt consumed. And then they also record over time the number of people that have cardiovascular disease or no cardiovascular disease. And then they sort out which of the people in the population are high, in this example, yogurt consumers, and those which are low yogurt consumers. And then when they have that sorted, and they have the data on cardiovascular disease, actual case numbers of cardiovascular disease, they can then mathematically compare the risk in the high consumers with the low consumers. And it involves quite a lot of mathematics, but it's quite a common process now. And even what I've just said it doesn't explain it all, of course, but in the time, that's probably they're the main features of it. And indeed, these are some results from prospective studies. This is actually from a range of studies in the meta-analysis where you put lots of different studies together and look at the overall effect. If we look at them, you can see that many of these studies for milk, particularly, and butter, The risks associated with the high consumers versus the low consumers are all in yellow. And that really means that there's neither an increased risk nor a reduced risk. It's neutral. And what we call the relative risk is 1. And indeed, the range around that relative risk overlaps 1. You can see in that 0.93 to 1.07. But if you look at the yogurt, particularly in relation to type 2 diabetes, you can see the yogurt is associated with a substantial reduction in risk of type 2 diabetes. You can see this one's 0.86, quite a lot below 1. Or in fact, it's a 14% reduction compared to the in the high consumer compared with the low consumer. And you can see that the confidence interval overlap 1. And similarly, in this study, which is a different study, the risk was also less than 1, as were the confidence intervals. It's not quite as low as that one, but you see that different studies give slightly different results. Cheese wasn't quite as promising in that regard. The relative risks were less than 1 for cardiovascular disease and stroke, but the confidence intervals were just creeping above 1. So probably all we can say that there was a tendency for cheese to be associated with the reduced risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke. But on the other hand, when we look at another study, this is from one of the EPIC studies, which is the multinational prospective study across Europe on the risks associated with cancer. This is actually data looking at non-fatal MI, or non-fatal heart attack, compared to fatal heart attack, basically, in roughly 500,000 subjects in this EPIC study, published a couple of years ago now. And again, you can see that as yogurt consumption increased, the relative risk, actually what they call the hazard ratio, it's essentially the same relative risk, reduces. So that the higher consumers, you can see it's 0.9, 10% reduction, and the confidence intervals below 1. And the overall trend, very significant. And similarly with cheese, as you increase the amount of cheese consumed, the relative risk or hazard ratio reduced, and significantly so. And this is what you see between different studies. But nevertheless, the trend, if you like, or the general consensus is that yogurt, particularly in relation to type 2 diabetes, but also in relation to other non-communicable diseases, in this case, heart attacks, basically, and cheese maybe not quite as powerful as yogurt, but generally quite beneficial. So the question then you might be thinking, well, how is it that happens? Why do we get that benefit when we know from lots of other studies that for many people across Europe, dairy foods are the biggest single source of saturated fats, and cheese will generally be giving more than yogurt. So why is that? Why is there a benefit? Well, first of all, let's look at the situation with yogurt and type 2 diabetes. And I have to say that there's a bit of speculation still in this picture that I've got here, but we think that these things are probably involved, but we do need more data. There will be further fermentation of the yogurt or components of it when some of it will reach the large intestine. Large intestine, as you know, I'm sure, is full of bacteria and other organisms, but predominantly bacteria, and they will carry out further fermentation. And the product of that fermentation are short-chain fatty acids. And from other evidence, from other studies, there is evidence that one of those, there's about 3 main short-chain fatty acids, but one of them in particular is associated with a reduction in insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance is an important component of type 2 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, the pancreas hardly produces any or very little insulin. In type 2 diabetes, generally it's associated with insulin resistance, where the pancreas still produces insulin, but the insulin is not as effective. So the body, if you like, is resistant to insulin. And so this would be a benefit. So that's one mechanism that we think might be involved. The other thing that we know is that, and we know this for pretty well certain, is the dairy protein, and there would be some dairy protein in yogurt, particularly some of the high protein yogurts. The proteins or the components of the protein, we're going to get to the small intestine, actually stimulate the production of hormones called incretin hormones. And the incretin hormones also have the effect of stimulating insulin production by the pancreas, insulin trophic. And we think the combination of those two things might explain some of the benefits of yogurt in terms of type 2 diabetes, but there may be other things. It's quite early days yet. And the other thing, of course, which we don't know really, is whether it matters what type of yogurt we consume. There's quite a wide range of yogurts now, as I'm sure you know. There's low fat, high protein, etc., etc. Some with sugar added, and fruit and so forth. So we don't know, but that needs to be looked at. Coming back then to cheese and the so-called dairy matrix. The dairy matrix, and I have to say most evidence on this is for hard cheese, of that sort of the sort of cheddar type of cheese, that sort of type. And this dairy matrix has a negative effect, has a reducing effect on circulating lipids, which is really circulating cholesterol and other lipids as well. And this is one study out of a whole series now, which compared the response that you got in both total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, which is generally regarded as the most risky one, if you like, after consuming 80 grams of fat per day or 36 grams of saturated fat, either as cheese or butter. So it's the same type of fat, just in different matrices, different foods, different matrix. And you can see what happened, that basically the cheese produced virtually no response in total cholesterol, no upward response in LDL cholesterol. In fact, if anything, it was a bit downward, whereas the butter produced substantial increases in both total and LDL cholesterol. Increases that you'd probably predict from some of the earlier work. And there's a number, this is just one study, but this has been repeated in quite a few studies. And so I'm pretty convinced this is a real effect. And one of the key things about this is that it is important to note that the cheese is providing more calcium than the butter. The calcium is important, because one of the things that emerged from these studies is that the change in LDL cholesterol response is dependent on how much fat is excreted in feces. Not a terribly pleasant subject, you may think, but important one. And basically what seems to happen is that the calcium from the cheese reacts with some of the fatty acids, probably from the cheese as well, and creates what are called soaps. These soaps are highly inert, they're not digested, and pass through the digestive tract and emerge as soaps in feces which contain fat. So that's why you see this negative relationship between, in other words, the more fat that's excreted in feces, the less change that happens in LDL cholesterol. The other area which is probably also important, time's pushing, I know, is the fact that there's also evidence that the calcium and phosphorus in the cheese also binds with bile acids. Bile acids produced by the liver come into the duodenum to help absorption of fat, digestion, absorptions of fat, but under most circumstances, a high proportion of those bile acids are reabsorbed and go back to the liver for reuse. And if you can actually block or reduce the amount of bile acids absorbed, then the liver then says, aha, I need to bring in more cholesterol from somewhere, because it uses cholesterol to synthesize bile acids. And so what it does essentially is it draws cholesterol from blood and in order to manufacture more bile acids, which it's determined to do actually. And this mechanism actually is one of the pharmaceutical approaches to reduce blood cholesterol. To actually, the pharmaceutical product actually inhibits the reabsorption of bile acids. So it's a well-recognized method, if you like, of moderating cholesterol, circulating cholesterol. And this isn't speculation. There's a number of studies which have actually shown increased bile acid excretion in feces in relation to hard cheese consumption. That's the effect of the so-called cheese matrix or dairy matrix, because it's part of the structure of the cheese. There's a chemical matrix in the calcium, but had there been time, I would have shown you some basically electron micrographs of cheese physical structure, which is also important, and it changes as the cheese gets older. So I'm conscious that I'm just about running out of time. A few quick conclusions. I think yogurt is associated with reduced type 2 diabetes risk. We don't know what the type of yogurt is, but we're beginning to know why that might be. Cheese is either neutral or beneficial in relation to cardiometabolic diseases. Hard cheese moderates blood lipid responses relative to butter. That's associated with higher fecal fat and higher bile acid excretion. And both of those are a function of calcium and to some extent protein and cheese structure and what type of cheese. And a couple of final questions really. How are we to deal with these effects in diet formulation? We haven't really sorted out how we do that actually. And are these effects big enough to be meaningful? I think they probably are. So time's up. I'll leave you with those few thoughts. I'm not in connection with you today, as you know, I think, but please pass on any comments or questions you have to the organisers and they will get them back to me and I'll come back to you with hopefully with some answers. Thank you very much.